The modification. They say necessity is the mother of invention, but I say it's desperation that makes engineers out of mechanics and visionaries out of men who just want to survive one more day. I was 23 years old when I first laid eyes on that P-51 Mustang, all silver skin and sharp edges, sitting on the tarmac like a promise we weren't sure would be kept. The North African sun beat down on us without mercy, turning metal so hot you couldn't touch it with bare hands. We were stationed at a forward airfield, nothing more than packed dirt and canvas tents, and the Luftwaffe had been running circles around our bomber formations for weeks. The Casas, those Spanish-built Messerschmitts the enemy flew, were faster than anything we'd seen, and they knew it. Every morning we painted new names on fuselages to replace the ones that hadn't come home. There was a sergeant in our unit, a quiet man from Ohio named Dutch Keller, who'd worked in his father's garage since he could hold a wrench. He didn't talk much, but his hands, those hands never stopped moving, always tinkering, always questioning. While the rest of us played cards and tried not to think about tomorrow's sortie, Dutch would be out there in the desert heat, staring at that Mustang like it had personally offended him. "She's fast," he'd say, running his calloused palm along the wing. "But she's not fast enough." We'd lost another pilot that afternoon, kid named Morrison, fresh-faced and eager, the kind who still believed the propaganda posters. The Casas had caught him at 12,000 feet, and by the time his wingman could react, Morrison was already smoke and prayer. I remember the sound of his mother's name crackling through the radio, over and over, until it wasn't a name anymore, just static. That night, Dutch didn't come to the mess tent. I found him in the hangar, illuminated by a single flickering work light, with parts of the Mustang's cowling scattered around him like mechanical entrails. His flight jacket was soaked through with sweat, and his eyes had that faraway look men get when they're seeing something the rest of us can't. "What are you doing?" I asked, though I'm not sure I wanted to know the answer. He didn't look up. "Reducing drag," he said simply. "Smoothing the airflow. Cutting weight where it doesn't matter. Redistributing it where it does." His voice was steady, mechanical, like he was reading from a manual only he could see. The Germans built their planes to climb. We built ours to dive. But what if we could do both? I watched him work through the night. The sound of metal on metal ringing out across the empty desert like a blacksmith forging some ancient weapon. He removed panels, reshaped intake ducts, adjusted the angle of the radiator scoop by degrees so small I couldn't see the difference. But Dutch could see it. In his mind he was already flying, already banking hard into a turn that would put him on a Casa's tail instead of in its crosshairs. The other mechanics thought he'd lost his mind. The squadron commander threatened to ground him for unauthorized modifications. But there was something in Dutch's eyes that made arguments die in your throat. A certainty born not from arrogance but from the terrible mathematics of survival. We'd lost 11 men in 3 weeks. What was one modified Mustang against that kind of arithmetic? The morning he took her up, the sky was the color of burnt copper, and the wind carried the smell of aviation fuel and sand. I stood on the flight line with the rest of the ground crew, watching as Dutch ran through his pre-flight checks with the same methodical precision he'd applied to every bolt and rivet. The engine caught with a roar that felt different somehow, sharper, hungrier. He taxied to the end of the runway, and for a moment everything was still. Then the Mustang leaped forward, gathering speed like it was trying to outrun its own shadow. The takeoff roll was shorter than it should have been. The climb angle was steeper, and when Dutch banked hard to the east, heading toward the morning patrol route where the Casas hunted, that plane moved like liquid mercury, smooth, impossibly fast, alive. We didn't hear anything for 2 hours. The radio was silent except for the distant chatter of bomber formations and the occasional burst of static that could have been anything or nothing. I stood in the operations tent, staring at the map with its pins and strings marking patrol routes and engagement zones, trying not to imagine Dutch's plane cartwheeling through the sky in flames. Then the call came through, calm and clear. 6 bandits engaged, 4 confirmed kills, 2 scattered, returning to base. The tent erupted in chaos, men shouting and slapping each other's backs, but I just stood there, staring at that radio like it might take the words back. 4 kills, in a single engagement, against the Casas that had been bleeding us dry for weeks. When Dutch landed, there was a crowd waiting. The Mustang touched down smooth as silk, and when he climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was dark with sweat, and his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that comes from dancing with death and leading. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate, just looked at that plane like a man seeing his own salvation reflected in polished aluminum. "She's faster," was all he said. "Faster than anything they've got." Word spread through the theater like wildfire. Within a month, every squadron wanted to know what that mechanic from Ohio had done to his Mustang. Engineers from the States came out to study his modifications, measuring angles and airflow patterns, trying to quantify what Dutch had understood instinctively. Some of his changes made it into official modifications. Others were too radical, too dependent on the individual aircraft. But every pilot who flew a plane Dutch had touched came back singing the same song. It was faster, more responsive, more alive. We stopped losing men to the casas, started hunting them instead. The war didn't get easier. War never gets easier. But at least the odds started to even out. At least we stopped painting new names on fuselages every morning. Dutch flew 47 more missions before a bit of flak caught him over Sicily, tore through his hydraulics, and forced him to ditch in the Mediterranean. He survived, spent 3 days in a life raft before a destroyer picked him up, and they shipped him home with a chest full of medals he never wore. I heard he went back to Ohio, took over his father's garage, and never spoke about the war, never told anyone what he'd done or why. But I remember the sound of that modified Mustang slicing through the desert air, faster than death, faster than fear. I remember the names we didn't have to paint, the letters we didn't have to write, the men who came home because one desperate mechanic decided the rules didn't matter as much as survival. They say war brings out the worst in us, and maybe that's true. But sometimes, in the space between terror and necessity, it brings out something else, a kind of genius born from the simple, terrible need to see tomorrow. Dutch wasn't fighting for glory or country when he took that wrench to that Mustang. He was fighting for Morrison, for all the Morrisons who'd burned in over the desert, for the chance that maybe, just maybe, the next pilot would make it home, and some of them did. Because of him. Because of what desperation and grief and stubborn hope can build when you give them metal, and time, and hands that refuse to stop moving. I'm an old man now, and the desert and the war are 60 years behind me. But sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light hits just right, I swear I can still hear it, that modified Mustang, roaring through the sky, faster than anything the enemy could throw at us, carrying boys home who would have otherwise been names on a memorial wall. And I think about Dutch, working through that endless night in the desert heat, reshaping metal and defying death one careful modification at a time, giving us all something we'd almost forgotten we could have, a chance. The thing about miracles is that they never stay miraculous for long. What starts as impossible becomes routine, and what was once Dutch's secret became standard procedure within 6 months. But by then the war had moved on, and so had we. We shipped out from North Africa in the fall of '43, following the bombers north as they began their relentless campaign against the industrial heart of Germany. The desert's brutal simplicity, endless sky, endless sand gave way to the patchwork green of the European countryside, and with it came new dangers. Flak batteries that turned the air into fields of shrapnel, cloud cover that hid both hunter and hunted, and winter, bitter and unforgiving, that made every mission a gamble against the cold as much as against the enemy. Dutch's modifications had given us speed, but speed alone couldn't protect you from a 20mm cannon shell or keep your oil from turning to sludge at 30,000 feet. We lost men in new ways, learned new fears, and Dutch, he kept working. Always working. I'd become something of his unofficial assistant by then. Not because I understood what he was doing, but because I'd learned to hand him the right tool before he asked for it. We had a language between us made of grunts and gestures, built in the cold pre-dawn hours when the rest of the squadron was still sleeping. He'd moved beyond simple speed now. He was thinking about survivability, about the split-second decisions that meant the difference between a pilot walking away from a crash landing or burning inside his cockpit. "Look at this," he said one morning in December, his breath misting in the frozen air of a hangar somewhere in southern England. We were standing in front of a Mustang that had limped home the day before with half its tail section shot away. The pilot, a captain from Tennessee named Breckenridge, had somehow kept her flying for 90 miles over occupied France. "The control cables run along here. See? Completely exposed. One burst of fire in the right spot and you're flying a brick." He traced the path of the cables with his finger, and I could see his mind working, rearranging metal and hydraulics like pieces on a chessboard. Over the next 3 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, Dutch redesigned the routing of those cables, added redundancies, installed protective plating in places the engineers back home had never considered. It added weight, precious ounces that every pilot felt in reduced fuel or ammunition. But the first time a plane came back with its primary controls shot out and the backup system still functioning, no one complained about the weight anymore. The other mechanics started coming to him, not just from our squadron but from the entire fighter group. They'd bring their problems like supplicants approaching an oracle, engines that ran rough in the cold, gun systems that jammed at altitude, canopies that frosted over and blinded pilots at the worst possible moments. Dutch would listen, his weathered face expressionless, and then he'd nod and disappear into the guts of the aircraft, like he was searching for its soul. He never claimed to have all the answers. Some problems he'd solve in an hour, others would take weeks of trial and error, of pilots reporting back after missions what worked and what didn't, a continuous feedback loop written in adrenaline and near misses. But slowly, imperceptibly, our squadron's aircraft became different from everyone else's. They were still P-51 Mustangs,
still built in California factories by the thousands, but they had Dutch's fingerprints all over them. Small modifications, personal touches, adaptations that made them extensions of the men who flew them, rather than just machines they rode. I remember the day Captain Reeves came back from a mission over Berlin and said his aircraft had felt like it was reading his mind. He'd been in a turning fight with two Focke-Wulfs, the kind of knife fight maneuvering that leaves pilots wrung out and shaking, and every input he'd made, the plane had responded instantly, precisely, like there was no separation between thought and action. Dutch just nodded when he heard that, the closest thing to a smile I ever saw on his face during the war. That's what I'm after, he told me later, as we were securing the hangar for the night. Not just speed or protection, harmony. The plane and the pilot become one thing, not two. When that happens, they both come home. But not everyone came home. Not even Dutch could change that fundamental equation. It was March of '44 when we lost Henderson. He was Dutch's best friend, the only person I'd ever seen Dutch laugh with. Really laugh, not just that tight-lipped grimace that passed for humor in those days. Henderson was a natural pilot, one of those men who seemed to have been born with wings, who could make a Mustang do things that violated both physics and common sense. He flew Dutch's first modified aircraft, the one that had started everything, and he treated that plane like it was a living thing, talking to it, making promises to it before every mission. They were escorting bombers to a ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt when it happened. The formation was already shot to pieces, bombers streaming smoke and falling out of formation like wounded birds, and the Luftwaffe had thrown everything they had at them. 109 ones, 109 us, even some of the new jets that were starting to appear, impossibly fast, like glimpses of a future we weren't sure we'd survive to see. Henderson had engaged a Messerschmitt that was making a run on a crippled B-17, got the kill, and was pulling out of his dive when the flak found him. Just one shell, just one piece of German steel in the wrong place at the wrong time, and his engine exploded in a gout of flame and black smoke. The radio recorded everything, his calm voice calling out his situation. No panic, no fear, just that professional pilot's tone reporting technical difficulties as his aircraft disintegrated around him. He tried to bail out. The canopy was jammed. 3 men saw him go down, saw the Mustang cartwheel into a forest somewhere south of Frankfurt, saw the explosion that meant no one was walking away. They brought back his personal effects, a watch, a wallet with a picture of a girl named Sarah, a lucky penny he'd carried since basic training. In Dutch, he took those items, held them for a long moment, and then he walked out into the cold English rain and didn't come back for 6 hours. I found him in the hangar, sitting on the wing of Henderson's plane, the one Henderson would never fly again, with a bottle of whiskey that was 3/4 empty, and tears running down his face that he didn't bother to wipe away. I made it faster, he said, his voice thick and broken. I made it more responsive, more maneuverable, more everything, and it didn't matter. He died anyway. They all die anyway. What's the goddamn point? I didn't have an answer for him. Still don't. War doesn't care about your modifications or your innovations, or how clever you think you are. It takes who it wants, when it wants, and all your desperate improvements are just a way of pretending you have some control over the chaos. But here's what I learned. Sitting there in that dark hangar with Dutch, listening to the rain hammer on the metal roof, the point isn't that you can save everyone. The point is that you try. You take your wrench and your knowledge, and your stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable, and you do what you can, even knowing it won't be enough, even knowing that tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, someone else won't come home. Dutch went back to work the next morning. Didn't talk about Henderson, didn't talk about anything, just buried himself in metal and mathematics, in the endless small battles he could win against gravity and drag and structural failure. And maybe that was his way of grieving, his way of honoring the friend he couldn't save, by trying to save everyone else. The modifications kept coming, kept spreading. By D-Day, there were elements of Dutch's work in aircraft across 3 fighter groups. By the fall of '44, engineers from Wright Field were incorporating his ideas into new production models. And by the time the war ended, in that strange quiet spring of 1945 when the guns finally stopped and we all had to figure out how to be something other than what we'd become, Dutch's fingerprints were all over the air war in Europe. They wanted to give him medals. The Army Air Force wanted to commission him, make him an officer, put him in charge of a whole engineering division. But Dutch refused it all. He'd done what he'd set out to do, given men a fighting chance. The rest was just paperwork and politics, and he'd never had much use for either. The last time I saw him was at the debarkation center in New Jersey, both of us waiting to process out, to become civilians again, to try to remember who we'd been before the war had remade us in its image. We didn't talk much. After 4 years of working together in the intimate silence of shared purpose, there wasn't much that needed saying. But just before he left, he turned to me and said, "You know what the funny thing is? We were all so focused on making the planes better, faster, tougher. But the real miracle was the men who flew them. They were the ones who made it all work. The planes were just tools. The pilots, they were artists. And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of returning soldiers, all of us carrying invisible wounds, all of us trying to figure out how to live in a world that didn't require us to be extraordinary every single day. I went back to civilian life, got married, had kids, built a career that had nothing to do with aviation or war. But I never forgot those years, those endless hours in cold hangars, watching Dutch transform metal and mathematics into something approaching grace. And sometimes, when I see a plane cutting across the sky, silver and clean against the blue, I think about all the small modifications, all the desperate improvements, all the little victories against entropy and death that made that flight possible. Dutch died in 1987, in his sleep, in the same town in Ohio where he'd been born. The obituary was 3 paragraphs long, mentioned that he'd served in World War II, that he'd run a successful garage, that he was survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. It didn't mention the lives he'd saved, didn't mention the innovation that came from his desperate nighttime work in desert hangars and cold English airfields, didn't mention that there were men alive, men with children and grandchildren of their own, who owed their existence to a quiet mechanic who refused to accept that things couldn't be better. But I know, I remember. And sometimes, that has to be enough. The war taught me a lot of things, most of them dark, most of them truths I wish I didn't carry. But it also taught me this, that in the face of impossible odds, some men don't surrender. They pick up their tools and they get to work. They modify, they innovate, they refuse to accept the way things are, and instead imagine the way things could be. And sometimes, if they're lucky, if they're skilled, if they're stubborn enough, they create something that outlasts them. Not a monument or a memorial, but something simpler and more profound. A chance, for someone else, to see tomorrow. Dutch gave us that. And for the men who came home, because his Mustangs were just a little bit faster, just a little bit tougher, just a little bit better, for them it made all the difference in the world.